We'll get started in just a second, and Anna has some breaking news she's going to share.
Yeah, lots going on in DC. I think July 2025 might be the busiest month in 20 years of education policy, and today is not disappointing. So we'll be excited to share some breaking news shortly as we let everyone in off out of the waiting room here. We'll get started. Just to share a little bit of housekeeping before introductions, we are recording this webinar session. We also are going to make the slides available for download afterwards. We'll make sure that there's a process that you all know in order to access those. So I know people have already asked for them in advance. Thank you for checking in. We are going to make them available. And thank you to Marguerite for lending your expertise to the content that we are going to talk about today. Um, just wait another few minutes here as folks continue to log in.
One more housekeeping,
Yeah,
where people can put questions in the Q&A, and we will try to answer them as we go or at the end. But that's where they belong in that Q&A if you have questions. And we're not encyclopedic knowledge of every last federal grant. So we may say that one we don't know, but feel free to put questions in the Q&A.
great. Thanks, Marguerite. I think you're close, though, close to encyclopedic. Um, Great. Well, I think we can probably go ahead and get started welcoming folks still into the meeting here, but I know everybody's busy and we're so grateful for your time. I'm Anna Edwards. I'm co-founder and chief strategy officer and advocacy officer at Whiteboard Advisors. Whiteboard Advisors is an education policy research, advocacy, and strategic communications firm in Washington, D.C. We've been really busy lately. For the last 20 years, I've spent my life actually doing most work out in states and districts, engaging with leaders on the ground on behalf of the organizations that we work with. DC has kept us particularly busy lately, which is what we'll be covering today. And thrilled to be joined by the person that I call, along with David DeShriver, our co-director of research, when I have questions about federal policy and funding, Marguerite Roza. So Marguerite, would love for you to give a quick intro on your work at Georgetown, and then we'll dive in.
Sure. So for those of you who don't know me, I lead Edunomics Lab at Georgetown. Edunomics Lab, if you've never heard that word, it's because it's a made-up word. Education and economics, obviously. And we do mostly all ed finance stuff. There's a lot of data on our website. We do a lot of trainings and are partnering here today with Whiteboard. Happy to talk about all of the uncertainty that is, dominating our inbox when it comes to ed finance news these days.
Great. Thanks, Marguerite. And we're thrilled to have you as a senior advisor to our team at Whiteboard Advisors. Just wanted to quickly, Thomas, you can go to the next slide. We'll get into some of the dynamics going on that are impacting the K-12 market right now. As I mentioned, 2025 has been a really busy year, and we've had a lot of transition here in Washington. We wanted to go ahead and share some news up front about the leadership at the Department of Education and share that we have heard that Penny Schwinn is going to be pulling out of the confirmation process for Deputy Secretary. It's been her choice. She secured the votes that would have been necessary to get into the office, but has decided that at this time it's best to contribute from the outside, and she's going to be playing a key role, still helping to advise the secretary in the department there, which is really important because we have some major issues facing K-12 education at the state and district level. And her experience in those positions in the states is going to make her really valuable and a huge asset to the department in that capacity as we navigate some of these dynamics at play. So with that, Marguerite, would love to turn it over to you to just share some of the environment right now, what it's feeling like for state and district leaders given the transitions and the state of play.
Sure. Yeah, so that's our breaking news now. We're getting back into our regularly scheduled programming around the dynamic K-12 financial landscape. But probably, the one that has been most on people's minds lately is the anxiety around federal funds.
Yeah.
And we'll have a little summary there. But two things as we go into that. One is the federal money isn't as big of a part of district budgets as sometimes that you would think given the news around it. Secondly, Congress is really pro federal money in schools. So a lot of times what happens is something will get proposed and then Congress comes back and says, I don't want to make those cuts. So just to, but that doesn't mean there's not a lot of anxiety. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And that is because, as you know, we've had ESSER extensions canceled and then renewed, and July 1st impoundments and then renewed, and there's another budget proposal out. So we'll talk about the anxiety in the system around the federal funds and what to make of that. The ESSER funds, that was the biggest ever one-time investment in public education. That ended. And so the school year that we're about to start is going to be the first sort of ESSER-free school year, and that's leaving some holes in district budgets. And there's not much the system can do about that, but it's adjusting to that loss of funds. There's still a trickle of little bits of funds here and there that are out there, but that's pretty much, gone. The other big pressure is these enrollment declines. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but the amount of enrollment you have in a school system drives your revenues. If you have fewer kids over time, a lot of that is a result of declining birth rates, but there's some other factors we'll be talking about. Well, then that's going to put financial pressure on systems. And strained state funding and uneven appetite for local taxes, depending on the state and the local area. The state money we know is going to compete with other sources, so that is going to be tight in some places. Either way, we're not likely to see the kind of year-over-year growth from state funding sources that we saw in the last decade. The next bullet is the rising recurring obligations. So with all that ESSER money in the system, a lot of school systems took on new staff, and those are putting some pressure on budgets. Now, we also have this issue where special ed expenditures are rising in part because special ed identification rates are up. So, the very moment when we'd be looking for some relief in terms of cost pressure, we're actually seeing some of that stuff really be a strain for school districts. And cannot talk about the money without talking about the achievement. There are persistent achievement challenges for sure, as many school districts started to see declines in their scores before the pandemic and then saw even deeper declines, have started to see some progress, but still have a ways to go. And last but not least, the emerging choice initiative. So obviously some states have taken on choice models, but there is that new one called ECA, which was part of that big, beautiful bill, which means there'll be a federal choice initiative, and we'll talk a little bit about that one. But that is not pulling money directly from schools, but it could be pulling students from schools. And there's a new mechanism to fund that through individual donations that come with tax credits. So that's what we're headed into. So let's jump away.
Yeah. And clearly, if you're working with districts and states, or your portfolio companies are, or you're a state or a district leader, I'm sure that you're feeling some of the uncertainty that this dynamic has created. But Thomas, let's go ahead and jump to just the play-by-play of what's happened this year. I know everyone's been closely watching what's happening with budgets, and it's not straightforward because we have several different budgets that are actually moving at once here and changes as they go. So we figured it could be good just to walk through the timeline of what's happened in 2025. In March, there was a continuing resolution that passed that would cover the school year 25-26. Congress approved that to fund all federal programs at FY24 levels. So that's flat funding for education programs for this school year that we're about to start now, and no Medicaid eligibility changes. What happened then, and I'm going to kind of jump over to the right side here. When on July 1st, I think a lot of the summer confusion came when it was announced that almost $7 billion of title funds were going to be withheld. Not Title I or IDEA, the really big buckets of federal funds, but Titles II, 3, and 4. And so that's where a lot of the summer scramble happened in terms of thinking through what that would mean if those funds didn't come back. I just wanted to go ahead and cover straight off the bat. We got the news on Friday at the National Governors Association from Secretary McMahon that those funds had been reviewed and were going to be fully released. And so that news came in on Friday. The funds are back and headed to states and districts. And so that means that for this school year, all funding, federal funding is remaining flat for now. And so just wanted to go ahead and make sure that everyone had heard that news from Friday. In parallel, we've had some conversations about ESSER late liquidation, the funds that hadn't yet been spent, that had gotten extensions in the previous administration. Back in April, states were informed that they were going to need to have those funds re-reviewed. So that added to some of the uncertainty over continuation of tutoring programs and other supports that those dollars were being used to fund. In late June, those funds were actually released back to the states as well. And so going into this school year, we're actually seeing flat funding across the board and no changes in federal investments to K-12 education. A few other things to note. Also in July, it's been a really, really busy month. The Department of Education and Department of Labor announced a partnership for administering the $1.4 billion Perkins grant for CTE, foreshadowing potential greater collaboration between the Department of Education, Department of Labor. And I know that there were some questions on the security of Perkins funding for the future that we might get to in a little bit, but interesting to see that notice go out. And then Marguerite talked about the ECA funding in the budget reconciliation bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. That was actually not the FY26 budget. I think there's a lot of confusion about that being the new budget, and that actually was not. It was a reconciliation bill that made some changes, including adding in the tax credit scholarship that we'll talk about later. Now looking forward, August 1st is tomorrow. Things that we're watching. There have been rumors about a potential pocket rescission of federal programs, certain federal programs. We haven't yet seen what that could look like. The FY26 proposed budget that the president put out did include flat level funding for Title I and IDEA, but did propose a new block grant program for those other funding streams. So that's something I think that we're watching. And with the release of funds that happened on Friday, it means that state and district leaders might be more cautious in how they're approaching spending those dollars given the FY26 budget. Although Marguerite reminded me the adage that the president proposes and Congress disposes. So still a long way to go with the FY26 budget. And then also just watching out for Title VI and Title IX. But Marguerite, I'd love to let you weigh in on just kind of this timeline. It's been a really busy year for you watching this, for everyone in DC and for those out in the field. Anything that you would add in?
Yeah, I think at the beginning of the administration, people said, wow, they're going to get rid of, Title I, IDEA. They're going to get rid of all this funding. It's going to go away. They're going to change all this stuff. And quite a few of us were like, those things are popular in Congress. So no, they're not, right? Like, and this is a thing to remember is there is a school in every neighborhood. So every single representative, Republican or Democrat, represents schools, school systems, neighborhood superintendents, boards, the whole thing. And education funding is pretty popular on both sides of the aisle. So if you even look at this timeline, I think some things are still true. Congress is not super keen on cutting education funding that goes to schools and districts. And even when you look at this, even we're whatever 6 months in, you see we already have Title I and IDEA funding for the next school year already, and in the proposed budget for the year after that. That's the big money from the federal government. The other thing is when there was a proposal to, pause this impoundment money, whatever, it was 3 weeks and they released it. And that's just sort of an indication of, I think while there's a lot of anxiety in the field, I think that the federal money is a little bit more secure, generally speaking, than you might have guessed from a lot of the back and forth. There's a question about Perkins. Perkins very popular. I wouldn't bet on Perkins going anywhere. That's for CTE programs. Somebody asked about supplement, not supplant. That's a language in the law of Title I. So that obviously gets transformed into a regulation. But I think at this point that wouldn't be going anywhere. And then, if you've been watching really closely, you might be worried about a pocket rescission that they could potentially get rid of some federal programs without necessarily having Congress vote on it. But Congress isn't going to let them do that, I think, under their watch. So things that, maybe for research or something that don't affect schools or not pass through dollars for schools, I think could be more vulnerable. But, and there are some programs that were on that impoundment list that go to state agencies that end up being a pilot or a competitive grant. Those might be a little more fragile, but anything that was formula funded down to schools, I think it will have more resilience once Congress pays attention to that. So despite all the back and forth, the federal funding has been more stable than we've watched. And this picture shows just puts that federal money in context. You can see that state and local governments are the big funders when it comes to K-12. The federal government's a small, and if you looked at those temporarily withheld funds, they were a small sliver of the small sliver of federal funds. And I don't think that was sort of well communicated in news or on Twitter or whatever, because what I heard from people who were consuming it was that, oh, the districts are going to have to cut 10%. And no, it's not great to cut anything, but it wasn't 10% of the total. A lot of that money went to SEAs, and not every district benefited from it. But at the same time, what you'll hear more as we go, the whole system is a bit financially strained right now. So each one of these things kind of piles on or creates some anxiety. And they're really important to vendors, because sometimes your little slice of this program or that program is the thing that you use to fund your product. And if the sliver of funding that earmarks that goes away, then you're sort of competing with the rest of the money to try to get your thing funded. So that's what's going on right now. And obviously these things can vary across districts and so on, but the disruptions have created some anxiety for school districts. And you can imagine that leaders might be like, I can't obligate to a contract right now because I have to wait to see how things play out. And the news is coming fast and furiously. Even if it's not a whole lot of money for their systems, these kind of late breaking changes can be destabilizing.
And I know all the conversations I had with state and district leaders on Friday and over the weekend, it was just such relief that those FY25 dollars came back, because it was Title II, professional learning, Title III, English language learners, Title IV, some of the mental health supports, and EdTech some of the EdTech had been released a little bit earlier, but really excited to see that come back. And now I think we're in an interesting moment looking ahead to FY26, where it was a bit of a test of what changes might need to be made if those cuts were to become permanent, or if they were to be put into the proposed block grant, which means they wouldn't be fully cut, but maybe consolidated into one funding stream and then reduced at a reduced level. And so I think for partners out there that are watching and trying to think through, how to be helpful in this moment, the funds did come back, but being creative about working efficiently, particularly in those areas that we saw in the withheld funds in July, is something to watch. I
And
think, oh yeah, go ahead, Marguerite.
yeah, I'll add on. So some of the funds that were in that impoundment, they went to SEAs, and then they didn't go by formula out to the districts. The SEA then played a role on deciding if they go which districts. A few districts can compete for them, or they can go to districts where there are more of that concentration of the student, or they could even go to a nonprofit or a university to provide something. And so really that is, as Anna says, a preview of what we could have in a block grant situation, where the money sort of comes together into a smaller amount, and they say, here you go, the SEA makes these decisions. I think some SEAs will say, well, I'm excited for the flexibility. I'm not excited for the reduced amount of money, obviously. And that would be, but SEAs probably face more impacts almost than districts do for these upcoming changes because federal programs fund a lot of the staff in SEAs. And if funds don't come with an earmark on them and they get lumped together, then that might mean the office of this and the office of that and the office of this goes away. Which, if you're a vendor and you're trying to tap that money, you're competing with a more broad set of priorities under a block grant situation. SEAs for, from since the beginning of time and districts have complained about federal rules and that this money is carved up into these different slices and needs all these different account codes. And in some ways, the lack of that would be a welcome piece of this, but anything that did actually shrink the dollar amount, I think they wouldn't be happy about. That said, like I said, I don't think it's going to be shrunk as much as that opening proposal that we just got for the budget, which would affect the 26-27 school year for school districts. So just there's a lot of time left before that, and it hasn't been adopted. But SEAs are facing some bigger changes coming their way.
Yeah. Great, Thomas. I think we can jump to some of the other challenging budget dynamics in the system right now. Declining student enrollment is something we talk about a lot in looking at where school budgets are, because school budgets are based on student enrollment and attendance. So, Marguerite, would love for you to talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of enrollment at the, state by state, but then I think it's also important to look at the districts within a state, which can also tell a different story.
Yeah, I'm just going to catch up real quick on a few other questions that came in. When will districts actually receive unfrozen funds? Well, as soon as basically that money is moving to states now, usually the state holds on to the money. The district has authority to spend it and then files for reimbursement in most states. That's how it is. So probably any day now they'll be able to expend it, which also already they're able to obligate it. So I don't really see any disruption there. I mean, school hasn't started anywhere yet. So, or maybe barely, like a few, Florida or something has a really early start date, but that money should be ready to go. And again, uh, even Title III, that's solidly funded for this school year. 26, 27, no one will know for a while that Title III is a Formula One. I expect there'll be some defense of that in Congress, so I'm not, betting that one just necessarily disappears. And as far as strings attached to proposed block grants, I think that the trade, it depends. There's two block grant proposal ideas. One, and we'll talk about this later, is that the department has asked people to apply or asked state agencies to apply for flexibility under the current arrangement. And some states are already in the VIP process of applying, Iowa, Indiana, I think Louisiana, others. And that would involve current funds. And the idea would be you could roll those together. They still go to the districts in the same amounts they went before, but you did your reporting in a collective way. So and in trade, you would focus more on outcomes. Now, a proposed block grant that's under the president's proposed budget for 26, 27, who knows? And that one, I don't know that I don't think there's any strings necessarily proposed in there, but don't quote me on that one. So just catching up on those. And I don't know if you had anything else.
Yeah.
Before we left this topic, I wanted to make sure we caught some of those.
There's a group of state chiefs that is actively collaborating with the department in thinking about accountability and block grants. And I've talked to several state leaders, actually red and blue states, that welcome the idea of the block grant notionally, not reduced funding necessarily for it, but because currently the way that compliance drives resource allocation, a lot of funding is spent on someone to go and like check the boxes, and then the districts have to submit specific forms, and it's become a really arduous process of just making sure that the boxes are checked. And so, that the state leaders have said if we could come up back with a plan to actually show how these dollars are contributing to improve student outcomes, we would welcome that and to not have to check the boxes. And let's come up with metrics that show how the dollars are being well spent on students. So I think it'll be interesting to see what comes of that. And I think it's going to be driven by states, to be honest, saying here's how we want to be held accountable for these block grant funds. So I would definitely stay tuned on that.
Right. Yeah. And so this next one is really the bigger financial effect for most districts in the coming years. And for many, it's already hit them in ways. But that is enrollment declines. And so the biggest issue with enrollment declines right now is that birth rates are down. And so where school districts are feeling it, they're feeling it on the front end of their enrollment, so kindergarten, first, second grade. And their high school students are still stable right now because those kids were born back when birth rates hadn't dropped. But these birth rates are really cratering in some areas. So what you can see in this map is the percent enrollment decline forecasted between now and 2031. The lighter colored states are the ones with deeper enrollment declines. And I'll point out sort of California, New York, Mississippi, Louisiana, Oregon, some New Mexico. Some of these are double-digit enrollment declines. Like California, the LA area, the larger LA area is going to be, much of that enrollment decline is from that area. So these enrollment declines will remake the education systems in ways we have not ever seen before. And then add into that historically, in the recent years, immigration was offsetting some of that. That is obviously tightened. And now, and this won't start up for at least until the 2027-28 school year, there's now a federal choice program, which we'll talk a little bit more about that. And that could move more kids over to private schools, probably not so much initially, but in the out years. So the school districts, that's going to be a big financial pressure for them. And many of them are going to close schools, lay off staff, and just it will, after a decade of growing budgets, will really be trying to think differently about their budgets. And that, they always protect labor, so there'll be, more resistance potentially to purchasing any kind of products that can help them boost their enrollment, or potentially uh, deploy or sell services, part of that new choice program, or potentially, grow preschool or those kinds of offerings. I think would be really welcome to school districts that are going to be fighting these enrollment numbers for a while. So this is the biggest one. And I think the news out there, so I'm not poo-pooing the federal effect because obviously the federal news is kind of destabilizing, but just to put it into context, for Chicago Public Schools, they have a $750 million budget hole. And I think it's roughly seven, I may not be getting the number exactly right, but something like that. And the federal funds that had been temporarily impounded were 14 million of that. So when you look at it, it was a drop in the budget compared to these bigger financial pressures that have come around because of labor negotiating and enrollment declines and all the other things that are facing Chicago public schools. So just wanted to make sure that was in context.
Yeah. And Marguerite, on declining student enrollment, I think the point about birth rate is really important. When I talk to school district leaders, say in South Florida, of course, there's been an impact on changes in immigration policy and students and families that are taking advantage of the choice program there. But ultimately, the biggest impact comes from students that just weren't born. Because you look now at 2025, 2020 was the pandemic in urban centers. You didn't necessarily see the babies born. And so I think there was a question that came in about the different age brackets and where we're seeing those losses. And it seems to really be right now the early grades, which then, of course, is going to have an impact as those classes of students move up. So just, I think, something significant to watch. And there's also a question about school consolidation and school closures. I know you highlighted that in the slide here, but for a lot of districts, including like really large suburban districts, those are very active conversations that are taking place because the students aren't necessarily there to support the number of schools. And it's very tough and very political to close schools, but a lot of superintendents are facing that in the coming years. So I
One
think
more
that,
thing to
oh
show
yeah,
here on the
yeah,
graph is, there's more pushback on choice programs in states that are already experiencing enrollment decline. So it's probably no surprise that you saw choice roll out in Florida and Arizona, places where there was less pressure from enrollment declines. And in some places, these enrollment declines have really already started. And there was one question, how much of this is out migration to other states? Well, that is why it looks different by state, right? So why, like Idaho, I guess people are moving there and still having kids in Idaho. So if you want to sell stuff, Idaho is your like hot market, I guess. But across the nation, the average is still down about 0.5% per year.
yeah. And I think that gets to also the next slide, which also looks at rising staff costs in light of these enrollment declines. So Marguerite, would love for you to walk us through what you're seeing in the data here.
Yeah, so the enrollment is the bottom chart, and you could see that enrollment was still climbing ever so slightly before the pandemic, dropped during the pandemic, and some of that was students, opting out of the system, homeschooling, pods, remember all of that. Some of them started to come back, but meanwhile, that's when the drop in birth rates was starting to catch up. And now what you see starting in 22, 23 is really steady declines, more deep in some areas than others, and never, the students didn't come back to fill in. They came back, but they were hitting again these enrollment drops in the kindergarten, first and second graders. So school systems, you can really see how bad it is for a particular school system when you compare the number of kindergartners to, say, the number of eighth graders or ninth graders. And if the number of kindergartners is quite a bit less, that's a forecast that there's a big, birth rate or out migration issue in that area. So, but the same time, the system's been bringing on more employees, and you're looking at over, just a lot of system-wide, a lot more employees, especially with the federal ESSER funds. Well, those employees are now in school districts. The ESSER funds are gone, and most school systems hate, letting go of staff. Many of them are thinking, oh, we'll shrink with attrition. We normally have a lot of people leave, but people aren't leaving when other school systems are not posting open jobs at the same rate. So a lot of people ask, well, who are all these new people? And you can see in the numbers we pulled there that the biggest chunk of them, not teachers, not paraprofessionals, but this category of all other staff. And for most of us, that looks like a middle kind of layer in school systems with interventionists, coaches, coordinators, counselors, mentor teachers, lead teachers, things like that. They're all this middle kind of layer, often really talented teachers that got promoted into these other positions. And then the school system went out and tried to hire a new teacher to fill that opening. So one of the concerns we have is what happens now they need to shrink their employees. And many of them are saying, wow, we have these higher, more expensive employees in this middle layer. Maybe those are the ones we offer early retirements, things like that. I think that's a big risk because that's where a lot of the talent is right now. And many of the people we hired to fill these teaching positions were weaker teachers that were deeper into the applicant pool during COVID. And so we're really hopeful that school systems can recognize where they have their talent and try to hold on to that talent, even if that means, not using their typical approaches for shrinking the workforce. Because some places can shrink a workforce and be smaller and stronger, and others can shrink a workforce and be weaker, smaller and weaker. And so that's going to matter a lot, I think, in the next few years. And I think school systems are going to be trying to figure out, how do I get meet the needs of my students with the employees that I still have. But the idea that they're going to be able to hold on to this many employees seems really quite a stretch.
Yeah. And Marguerite, I think it's also an opportunity for technology, particularly for like back office operations. And so we're starting to see districts investing in infrastructure and systems that might help to make the system more efficient so dollars can be directed back into the classroom. So I think that's something to watch. There's a question about IT employees in a district and the amount of technology costs that might be going up. But also could, I think the flip side of that is produce some efficiencies in the operational side in particular. There's a lot more discussion to have probably later about AI in the classroom and teaching and learning, but one of the things that isn't discussed as much, but where there's real potential is in just all of the operations of a district.
Yeah, well, the other thing here, and we got a couple of questions on, even just the shrinking, that I would say the vast majority of districts are saying, oh, we'll shrink with attrition. And I don't think that's a student-focused strategy. I think that's avoiding conflict and pink slips kind of strategy. But we have one question, and a lot of districts, especially districts that where it was harder to hire, brought in a lot of non-certified employees. Maybe they're less effective, maybe they're not, but they were definitely, trying to fill open classrooms. And what's interesting is they haven't not necessarily gone back and said, well, here's our chance. These are non-certified, or maybe they're still in probationary period. Let's take a look at the data, see if they're worth saving or exiting, and exiting the weak ones. I just talked to a superintendent of a large district this last month that was basically saying, well, we don't have a shortage anymore, but I'm still got all these classrooms filled with non-certified teachers. And I was like, well, then that's by choice because you're holding on to them because you filled them in the previous year, but this year you don't need to keep them if they're not really effective. And maybe this is an opportunity. You might have to still honor that salary to keep those stronger middle layer people in your system, but maybe moving them back to the classroom to do that. We have seen some school systems offer teachers, I think San Francisco, over $100,000 to leave. And I like you're offering your strongest talent to walk out the door and you're paying them no longer to teach in your district. It just seems like a time when we need fresher strategies to manage our labor in this way. All right, let's do the next one.
Yeah, let's another highlight, state budget strained. We had seen such increases in K-12 funding at the state level over the last few years that went alongside the stimulus funds. And one of the things, Marguerite, I know that you've been looking at is the impact of state budgets on districts and some declines we've seen there. So would love to hear you talk through what you're seeing at the state level.
Sure. So this is just a map from Pew that shows how many days states could go on rainy day funds, and I think they're down to 4.9 days or something like 5 days or something like that. Here, where the lighter colored, I'm sorry, 49 days. The lighter colored um, states are the ones that are more that have fewer essentially reserves or rainy day funds. And that means that's a sign that the state budget is more fiscally stressed. And so that's, Washington State, Utah, Illinois, Tennessee, Florida, a few other ones, New York. And that means that when K-12 says, hey, by the way, we have this federal thing cut, or, I need more money for this, or enrollment declines this, that, or the other. Could you send us more money? The legislature is already dealing with a lot of other cost pressures, and there are a lot of other priorities in states besides K-12 education. K-12 has historically been the biggest, but states also fund higher ed, and they also fund a lot. Obviously, they put a bunch of money toward Medicaid. And during the American Rescue Plan, they got flooded with cash for relief funds, and that money has also gone away for them. So there's a lot of pressure for states to stand up other kinds of obligations, and that means K-12 is likely facing a little more strained revenue source when it comes to the state. Still going to have to make its case on that. Meanwhile, and we'll get more into this in a bit, that state leaders are getting impatient in some states with K-12 systems that aren't showing as much progress as they hoped. So you're starting to see, the governor in Oregon saying things like, we need, if we're going to put more money in, we want to see more progress. And they're not the only ones. And so with those kinds of assertions at the state level, you have the sense that the state money is a little bit in flux. It's not going to be kind of just cash going straight to districts in the way it always been, but states might say, fine, I'm going to put some more money in, but we want to have a bigger say in what that money does. It can't just be around saving employees that when your school district is shrinking. So I really think the state the state leadership is a place to watch, both in terms of the amount of money, which I think will be tighter, but also the kind of priorities they put forth in putting any new money into the system.
It's a great point, Marguerite. While we might not see per pupil funding increase and across the board funding going out, we are seeing programmatic investments in tutoring and high quality instructional materials and ELA and math, in school safety. And so I think that's probably
Assessments, other kinds of things, yeah,
exactly,
like a
yeah.
lot of that. And yeah, people have been asking the AI question. AI for sure, hot, 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 not just at the state level, but also at the federal level. So I think there will be, that's an area to keep watching. That's something that, people have not lost their interest in AI yet. CTE is another one where both at the state and the federal level, lawmakers are really supportive of that kind of stuff. So those probably will enjoy some more opportunities going forward.
Yeah, and I think there was a question that came in specifically on the request for comment that came out from the Department of Education about AI. The comments are due on August 20th, I believe, for that request for comment and something to take a look at. It outlines some priorities related to use of AI for teaching and learning, for educator efficiency, and also for AI literacy and building the AI literacy of students in K-12 and higher ed. And so put a flag in the sand for sure that the department is going to be prioritizing AI in upcoming grants, in potential discretionary grants, potential block grants. We also saw similar requests for comments around science of reading and school choice. So yeah, definitely watching that. The White House also put out a pretty significant AI plan that came out last week as well. Thomas, I think we can flip to the next slide. Um, Actually, probably a great segue into the policy side of things and ESEA flexibility. A letter actually came out on Tuesday. That was a guidance letter from the Department of Education about how states can use the existing flexibility in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, so the accountability law that governs state and district funding. And so it was interesting to look at the ways that they both emphasized the current flexibilities that are in the law for piloting innovative assessments or transferring funds, shifting improvement strategies for school improvement, an opportunity to do some admin consolidation. But actually, the guidance encouraged even more creativity in the opportunity for states to submit waiver requests for barriers to new school models or things that states think they need to support student achievement, particularly again on low performing schools, as Marguerite had mentioned earlier. Definitely something to watch. Interesting to see the letter come out on the heels of conversations about the block grant, because you start to see, okay, if we have more flexibility in funding, then let's also talk about states having the opportunity to propose new accountability systems or approaches to track student progress. And so we're closely watching this one from a policy standpoint. In some ways, the letter did feel like a flashback because we actually saw a very similar waiver process for No Child Left Behind in the Obama administration that then led to ESSA. So, Marguerite, I'd love to get your hot take on this one.
Yeah, well, I just a couple things. I think there's definitely this push for more flexibility and all this. One thing that popped up in the Q&A, by the way, was the breaking news that Penny Schwinn has withdrawn. We actually did break that news at the top of this webinar. So if
Good.
somebody missed the top, yeah, it was
But
anyway.
good news, she's staying on to support all of this
Yeah,
work.
yeah. Thank you for staying on. But I will say that it's from the beginning of time, people have complained about all these federal restrictions. I think they're not so onerous, but they do require that federal programs stay in these different buckets, and that creates a staffing obligation. So what you end up with is somebody who runs this title program, and somebody who runs that title program, and who runs that title program, and all of these. And so I think there will be an appeal to potentially be able to seek some of that flexibility. And And I think some people are feeling nervous that without these, by lumping these things together, will students have lost their protections? And some of the protections that are in law cannot be overridden. I think that's still very clear there.
Yeah.
It's definitely an open question of whether or not OCR will have the staffing to investigate violations of those things. But I think most of these big federal programs are going to feel pretty similar as the same as they were before from the district side, with the exception that we'll probably see a lot less emphasis on reporting going forward. So I'm not sure if that's helpful on this, but for vendors, thinking about a more holistic way of helping school districts serve all the students that are of high needs might be, one sort of appealing, instead of saying we offer this for this narrow group, thinking we offer this and here's all the types of students who can benefit from it, might
Mhm.
be, something that's helpful there.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see assessment conversations take off as well because ESSA has provided, and really going back to No Child Left Behind, ESEA more broadly, the air cover for states to ensure that assessments are offered and that we are making sure that all students are performing across various subgroups. And so, I think that'll be something that everyone will be watching and ensuring, trying to ensure that we don't go back to a point of anti-assessment and students slipping through the cracks. So a lot to come on that. And I know again, I think probably that gets to our next slide of what's happening now and kind of where states are leading and what to watch. But for sure, just to jump to the second point, the administration has said that since coming in, but really the momentum of state leaders coming out of pandemic response, I would say, was really powerful. And so, even though the return education to the states mantra that the administration has had is really nodding in many ways to the momentum already underway in leadership with ESSER funds, leadership in pandemic response, and now thinking through new programmatic funding, rethinking accountability. And that's really going to drive the market in many ways. So would definitely pay attention to what you're seeing in state budgets, to state superintendents and what they're prioritizing. So just really, really
And
critical.
even governors. I mean,
Yeah,
even some of the
governors,
governors. I mean, if
absolutely. Yeah.
you're watching Colorado, the governor there is very much taking the lead on that one.
Yeah,
Hmm.
the National Governors Association, it's a great flag, Marguerite, just put out Governor Polis's roadmap from his chairman's initiative. He spent the last year focusing on bringing governors together to talk about pre-K through 16 education and alignment. So that is out now from the NGA, came out over the weekend. And incoming chair, Governor Kevin Stitt from Oklahoma, is also really going to be doubling down on this conversation about education, workforce alignment, apprenticeships, um, career exploration going back to middle school. So definitely watching the governors is important. And then I think districts are responding to, there were a lot of questions about AI and district response to bringing in AI and consolidating schools. I was down, and I don't think he would mind me citing him by name, but Howard Hepburn, the superintendent of Broward County, Florida, said we have to find the opportunity amidst the chaos. And this was, when ESSER had been pulled back and there still wasn't certainty about what was coming with federal funds and a lot in flux with district demographics. And we are seeing leaders, I think, respond and say, we need to listen to our parents. We need to hear what they're interested in their schools. There are a lot of constraints, there's a lot of pressure, but this is the time that we should actually create the school environment that is going to attract students and families, and that we're helping to produce the outcomes that the community wants. And so I think watching those leaders respond in this moment and supporting them is going to be really important. And Margaret, I'd love for you to talk about the FY26 budget proposals to watch, and then some of the things that you're seeing solution providers and vendors do to respond in this market.
Sure. Yeah, the one thing I'll say is that so somebody put in the chat that, do you think the enrollment decline will solve the teacher shortage? The teacher shortage is over. Not everywhere completely, but that already happened. And part of it, the teacher shortage was created in part because all that federal money got dumped on the system after COVID. And so districts did what they do when they have money is they hired a bunch of people and they obliterated the existing labor pool. So already we can see nationally that districts aren't hiring right now. And so I feel for the young people that have just gotten their teaching certificate and they're out there looking for a job. There aren't any. And that's not completely. There's some jobs and still a lot of turnover in special ed and in some of the math and science programs.
Yeah.
But so that's there. But I think that one thing to pay attention to going forward is that obviously it's hard for districts to shrink their labor force, and they'll be looking for solutions where they have some of the natural shrinkage in their labor force. And I'm thinking about places like math and science, but also special ed or for roles in high poverty schools. But special ed always has a lot of turnover. It's a tough job. They always have a lot of turnover. And you can imagine a vendor saying, hey, this is where AI or some other tool can really help you when you don't have the same staffing that you used to in this field. There'll be like more immediate uptake, I think, because it solves,
Yeah.
their
Teletherapy.
cost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, all that kinds of stuff. And I think the same is true in high poverty schools, right? High poverty schools see a lot more turnover in staff. So really kind of thinking about those high poverty schools and high poverty districts as potentially having more fluid money. The other thing we're paying attention to is outcomes-based contracting. States are big on this, especially, but some of the bigger districts are, where the vendor has agrees to some sort of outcome target as a condition for part of its funding. If you haven't heard of that, you want to be paying attention to that one. So we'll talk about this a little bit more, but for the most part, the FY 26 school year, 25, 26 is pretty set. I don't think it's going to see as many disruptive changes, with the exception of all the ones that enrollment declines and stuff are coming around. So though I can imagine if you sell something that really helps kindergartner students, this might be a tough year for you. But there might be some ways to potentially expand the pool. There are, these new choice programs coming out, and if you can sell your product to a private school or a network of choice programs or something else like that, there might be an opportunity there. We talked about the ECA law will stand up all these new organizations called SGOs, scholarship granting organizations. So we'll blink and somehow by 2027, there'll be a gazillion SGOs, new organizations. They're obviously going to need supports to be able to take in and then move scholarship money.
Mhm.
And I think the other thing, it's so it's not all negative now. There's still a lot of change. When there's change, there's opportunity as well.
Yeah.
One thing we argue, make it easy to say yes. So if what you're selling is often covered by a specific financial grant that comes from the state or the federal government, you could offer a guarantee that if that grant gets canceled, the contract will be canceled, because they might be reluctant to sign a contract, if they feel like there's uncertainty going forward. So those kinds of things in there, a more flexible timeline, so that they can handle potential funding delays. But I really think that right now what you're hearing from districts is there's just anxiety. They don't know what's around the corner. And if you say, yeah, I don't either, so we'll make this contract work, even if something, you can cancel it if something comes our way that we didn't foresee. And then I think really this with the outcomes-based contracting, really knowing what the outcomes are that you're producing, and this so that you can be clear about that. That seems to be increasingly important, especially at the state level, but also at the district level. And then knowing where the decisions are made, a little more control shifting to states. I think you want to be staying close to state level priorities, really paying attention to what the state leaders are saying, so that you have this opportunity to kind of recognize when there's an opening. There might be legislators that will, put something into the state budget because they're frustrated that districts aren't using it. I'm imagining like some sort of software that they think can help students. As far as the districts, they're going to be financially strained, more so in the states we showed, and more so in big urban districts are seeing more enrollment decline. But if you are trying to reach one of them, being sensitive to that, a product that potentially builds enrollment or something else like that can also be helpful. But otherwise, realize that the landscape is shifting and you might have some more successful targets outside of the big urbans.
Great. Yeah, we'll get to a few more questions here before we have to wrap. There's a question about the fact that federal funding guides have been used to help districts understand how to purchase, in this question, ed tech solutions, but I think probably in other areas too. What resources would you recommend to stay aligned with current funding strategies? I wanted to answer this question more about kind of capacity outside of the federal government that could play a big role at the moment. So I would encourage for that question on ed tech to look to CETA, the State Education Directors of Technology Association, ISTE. There are organizations that are helping to step in and have already been doing a lot of work in providing resources. And those state associations, I think, are going to be in high demand. Education Commission of the States and National Governors Association, CCSSO. So I would really lean on the state associations for a lot of those questions, and they're certainly providing a lot of resources right now. Marguerite, any of these other
Yeah,
questions that you want to take the
yeah.
last few?
Somebody, the couple of questions about the teacher shortages. So one place to look. So normally in a normal year, we would see 8% turnover in our teachers. And so you would look for like 8% of positions to be posted as open. If you go onto a website called Work in Ed, you can actually select a state and see how many openings they have. And if you compare that number of how many openings they have, you just look to the bottom of the site and it will show you. And then you compare it to their total workforce. Some of them are down to like 2% or 1% or so. So really we have shifted away from this big hiring frenzy. That's a great way to do it. I don't think the data are very good for Montana, but most other states, that's a good way to do that. And somebody was asking about the leadership shortages. I would say right now we probably have a lot of people in that middle layer. When I say middle layer, I'm counting that up to principals and, director of curriculum, all the way to teacher interventionists. And some of them are taking early retirement and they're out on the job market seeking an open position. The job that's not super fun right now is the CFO. So that, I mean, it's so many emails that are, hey, we have an opening in our CFO position, really high value position. Can you send us a bunch of names? And I'm like, well, not unless I take the good ones out of the districts they're already in. So there's so many openings there. We recommend you come, people are interested in that role, come do our certificate in ed finance. But the CFO position is a tough one. A lot of turnover there. And then there's a bunch also, some of the higher stakes superintendency changes, where it's really hard for a superintendent if you're in a district that's doing budget cuts to continue harmony with the board, and there'll be board turnover, and then superintendents will leave. So I think that level of leadership is really tough right now. But I wouldn't say that we have a shortage of that middle layer in the system necessarily.
Well, I think we're just about at time. I want to thank everyone for being on today. Marguerite, thank you for lending your expertise and insights into what's been a pretty crazy year so far, but also one where we see some opportunity to partner up with states and districts and try to work through to help improve student outcomes. So we would love to continue the conversation. Please sign up for Whiteboard Advisors newsletters. Our notes newsletter comes out weekly, and we'll also be posting this webinar for further viewing, as well as the slide deck to everyone who was on and those who registered. So thank you so much for being with us, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.